Costa-Hawkins was passed in 1995. It's a measure that basically makes the state control all rent control, and it doesn't allow the individual cities to impose their own individual rent controls. And so it's been on the ballot many times since 1995. And every time it's on the ballot, everybody thinks like this means there's going to be rent control in the state of California, which isn't true. And we already have a form of rent control with SB 1482. So what this actually does is just makes it so that the individual cities could impose their own rent control. So even if this passed, all cities could still elect to not to do rent control. And so I think that's like the big difference and the misunderstanding that people are going to get when they're reading this act for sure, because people who are in favor of rent control think voting for it means they're going to get it, and it doesn't mean that.
Does it also abolish the vacancy control, the ban on vacancy control?
I believe that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Because Costa-Hawkins allows you to reset the market rate once you have a vacancy. So if you were to repeal that, it would allow you to then impose a rent control where you can't re-rent at market rate.
And that's got to be the biggest impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
For sure. Yeah.
If you had a tenant for the last 10 years and you've been giving them like decent rates and then they move out and you can't raise the rent like to market rates, that seems not a great idea.
I know of a lot of landlords who've been, owning properties for 20, 30 years. And if you have like more than 50 units, I feel like it's like a rite of passage to have that one tenant who's been with you for so long. And maybe it's an older lady or an older gentleman, and they've had a lower rate and they have fixed income, and that landlord kind of takes it upon themselves to take care of that person and trying to help them out. And so they never raise their rent throughout the time, or maybe they only raise it a small amount. And so the vacancy control factor, this will really make it so that those landlords don't do that anymore.
Well, and the thing is too, with longer term rentals like that, people who have been in a unit for 15 plus years, obviously when that person moves out of that rental, the landlord's going to want to come in and most likely want to do repairs to that. And obviously then would increase the rental rate based upon the new condition of the place. So that's kind of the big loophole here, right? There's that side of it where you want to take care of your renters, especially if they've been there for a long time. But once they move out, changes need to be made, and the incentive goes out the window if you can't increase that rental rate.
So do you think that areas that are more dependent on the quality of construction within the unit, like the granite countertops, the stainless steel appliance, things like that, those areas that are more dependent on that for the price factor as opposed to location based? So for example, like Monterey and Santa Cruz, they're very location-based rental markets. So market rents are really justified by where it's located at, whether it be in a certain school district or location close to the beach. But like in Fresno, Ethan, I got to imagine where like putting in those upgrades in the units is going to have how much do you think on a percentage basis that increases the rent value? And is it now going to make it so that people just really don't do that type of stuff if this is passed?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. When you add amenities to the house, like the nicer countertops, you add a nice fridge in there. Even sometimes like having a good, well-maintained pool that adds some extra value to a house that a lot of families look for. And I think, adding something like vacancy control, rent control, that's going to really desensitize a lot of landlords from wanting to improve their properties, and going to have an adverse effect on, really adding more houses to communities like Fresno, Monterey as well.
For one example, my landlord had a tenant that they did a turnover in, and he had a vacancy, and he had to figure out how much money was the turnover going to cost and how much more could he increase the rent to pay himself back for the improvements that he made. And so if you're not allowed to change the rent during that vacancy, then that eliminates the incentive, as you guys said, to do those turnovers. And then it's like, why do they do the turnovers? But you need to be able to make that money back as a landlord, because at the end of the day, it's a business.
Yeah, we have a property in Seaside right now. It had a tenant in there they were there for 21 years. They moved out, and the owners having to put over $30K into the house to get it back to rental standards. And who's going to be incentivized to do that? Who's going to put $30K into their house if they can't return any of that money? That's a big concern too. They're just going to keep things at the minimum, because if their rents can only be returned at a minimum, why would they put more if they can't even recoup that?
So Brett, would it be the same impact too then for like, would you probably not want long-term tenants in general then probably?
I think that everyone's goals are different. Property owners' goals are different, right? I mean, some people don't mind that. Some people like the security of long-term renters. It all depends on someone's objective, what they want to accomplish, I think. But yeah, I mean, like in current days, it's like, having a tenant in there for 15, 20 years, that's not always a great thing. Turning that unit over, 5 years or so, 3 to 5 years on average, it's like, you can keep that unit fresh, and it's always going to make sure that you are giving renters a top quality unit, and not something that's going to become run down and things not working and even borderline habitable. I think that's the big concern.
I like what you mentioned there, Brett, about like the turnover, because there is a natural turnover in rentals. Probably depends on area to area. Probably in the city, it's more common for turnover. But I think with rent stabilization and rent control, maybe that turnover might change. Maybe there's more long-term rentals. And I mean, there might be pluses and negatives. One thing that stands out to me at first glance is that turnover is extended. If people are staying in places longer because that rent control is in place and that rental rate stays the same or nearly the same for a long period of time, the growth of these cities might change too, and the diversity of the neighborhoods too, as well, because people aren't able to move in and move out. Well, people aren't able to move in because people are staying there longer, is what I'm trying to get at. And that maybe natural cycle of the rental cycle maybe is changed in some sort of way. So I think it'd be interesting to see maybe what might change in that regard to the demographics and overall diversity of neighborhoods, possibly affecting the growth of them as well in the long term.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, actually. I think being from Fresno, we kind of see that a lot, where you have some of the lower income areas. If rent control is there, stabilizes, that's going to really hinder the growth of those specific areas, because it's not going to be able to expand and, truly get better if everyone's staying in place and no one's moving out.
Then also it won't expand if your investors and your builders aren't incentivized. Like if the incentives are on the side of the people who are living in the units, I mean, it always should be fair. But if all the incentives are swayed to their side of the equation, then those entrepreneurs aren't going to take those risks. And ultimately, those risks are what's going to increase the housing supply. And housing supply is what's ultimately going to regulate the cost of rental prices. And we haven't seen rental prices skyrocket the way that we've seen home prices skyrocket in the last 5 years. State of California, average homeowners gained 60% equity. Rental rates haven't gone up 60% in 5 years.
One thing to kind of piggyback on your point is, we all know that California has, a housing market crisis right now. Like we don't have enough housing for tenants. And, how will this affect the housing if people aren't incentivized to get properties and rent them out? We need more housing right now, not less housing.
That's the other big thing at Costa-Hawkins is that right now properties built after 1995 are protected, that they can't have rent control for single family home and condominiums. So if you were to repeal that, who's going to build if they're going to have a rent control on it? What investors are going to come from out of the area to build units and apartment complexes and stuff like that? Why would they do that if they're going to be limited to what they can return? Something
that I see personally from like my day to day is a lot of investors I work with are not these, guys that own 10, 20, 30 units. A lot of them are, first generation, trying to build generational wealth for their families. They come from other countries, and it's just, I feel like doing something as drastic as increasing the rent control like that is going to really decentivize them as well to buy properties and, build that generational wealth for themselves.
Do you think they'll not buy, or do you think they'll go to different states?
I think they could go to different states to buy, or they would not buy altogether. And, one family in specific I'm thinking of, I had talked to them a couple of weeks ago. It was a Vietnamese family. They, came to America like 20, 30 years ago. They opened up shop with a nail salon, and they just recently bought an investment property after, 25 years of hard work. Super excited about it. And they're like, yeah, we're like just barely making payments on this. Like we're losing a little bit of money each month. But, next year we're really hopeful because we know we're going to be, making profit. And like, this is our dream. We want to make this happen. And I think adding something like rent control, vacancy control, that's going to really stop a lot of people's generational wealth dreams, building a great future for their children. So that's another side to look at that too.
That's awesome. American dream at work right there.
Yeah, really was.
One thing that you were talking about was just lack of new homes or like inventory. And I was actually looking up some statistics for California, and I know this is year over year, this year from last year, and some of that has to do with interest rates, I'm sure, and builders wanting to kind of hold back a little bit. But I think single family starts, which would be new homes starting, is down 19%. And then multifamily in California is down 7%. Basic economics of supply and demand. If you don't have supply, the prices are going to go up. Which that's kind of what you've seen, obviously, the last couple of years with the real estate market. So I don't know.
What's causing the decrease? What's that?
Well, that's a great question, because I'm coming from another state. I've actually heard that California has really strict laws on building new properties, whether it's large plats or even smaller ones. So I've heard that before. You guys can obviously probably attest to that a little bit in more detail than what I know. But you mentioned earlier, or somebody mentioned earlier, that, would investors look to other states? You can see the other states, Texas, Florida, other one, Tennessee, I believe, North Carolina. You're seeing a lot of growth and home building happening there. So it's almost like a precursor to starting to see, you're seeing the larger investors going to other areas. You're going to start seeing the smaller investors follow suit.
Are they building affordable housing, or are they building housing that pencils out with the current construction cost too, though?
Most of it, I would assume, in those areas is going to be, just regular market rate.
Yeah. So question for you guys, kind of like on a devil advocate side, like picture if we're the tenant or somebody who's in support of having rent control. What is that person hoping to accomplish that AB 1482 currently doesn't already fulfill? Because it limits rent increases and it causes you to have a justified reason to give an eviction. So like what more are people looking for than that?
Probably protection is of the properties that are exempt from AB 1482.
So single family homes and
condos.
1995. Yeah.
You figure people who have families and stuff like that, they're living in single family homes and they're not protected in any way. So to me, that's the biggest thing, because all these repeals, it doesn't really apply to apartment complexes because we already have AB 1482.
Right.
Yeah, the property I lived at in SoCal before I moved down to Sunnyvale, the rent when I moved there was $1,900, and the landlord increased it to $2,600, which is a huge jump in rent. And it was affordable, but it became much less affordable, and then it just eats into your savings, and then it limits your ability to then save for a property and not be a renter anymore because you're spending all of that additional income on your rent. So to Brett's point, living in a single family home is challenging when you are subjected to, dramatic increases like that.
Any other devil advocates that might be reasons for supporting, other than because that percentage of the population that lives in single family homes that are not currently covered by AB 1482, I have to think that's a small percentage of the population. I got to think the biggest percentage is the people who live in these apartments that think that this is going to have an effect on them where they're already benefiting from rent control. And I think there might be some miseducation on that as well.
I think they may also be hoping
tenants know.
Yeah, I think they may be hoping that the rent control will get even more strict. And instead of being limited to that, 5% plus CPI or the 10%, maybe it'll be even less, and it'll keep their rentals even cheaper. So that would be the only thing I could think of, is hoping that it will be even more stringent than what we currently have in place.
Well, I'm sure they're right in like Berkeley, San Francisco, Oakland, Mountain View, all these places, Los Angeles County, like all these places that really have already extreme rent control in place. I'm sure, the lifting of Costa-Hawkins would help those cities do even more. But man, I can't really buy into somebody then purchasing investment properties in those neighborhoods. Like I know a lot of our investors will say, like, don't send me anything in Oakland.
An interesting point. Most of those areas that you just mentioned have some of the highest levels of homelessness. they have the strictest rent control, the higher levels of homelessness. And maybe that's because there's no investors building properties to put them for rent because they know that they can't get like a justified rate to, get a return on investment.
Well, Kyle, you mentioned earlier, it's like Monterey is based on location. But I mean, some of those areas are amazing locations as well. I mean, they're right by the ocean. Look at Santa Monica, right? Santa Monica used to be referred to as Skid Row by the sea. It's because they had a rent control where you're right on the ocean, you're beautiful properties, but owners just stopped taking care of properties and everything just became, dilapidated and, no one was doing maintenance. Everything was deferred and the place became kind of a mess. You also promote things like, black market for renters. If you have a rent control and you can only charge them $1,500. Well, if I have a friend who wants to rent it for $2,000, I'm going to pocket $500. It's a black market. You're promoting subletting, illegal subletting too. I had a friend who lived in San Francisco and they illegally subletted their place from their friend because they couldn't find a property in the area they wanted in a price range that they can afford. So they had a friend who was moving out and she legally subletted to them and she made a little bit of money and they got to pay less. It's like, so those things are all negative things too. I mean, I know we're trying to play devil's advocate for renters, but it's hard with this one because there's so many things that renters aren't really understanding of, of what really will happen if this does get repealed.
I get that, but going back to like the devil's advocate side, just coming from Fresno area, that in my personal experience, I've seen that rent jump from $1,500 for a 3-bed, 2-bath house sometimes for now it's going to be $2,200 for that same house. So, a lot of these families are not able to afford it because the wages haven't, really matched what the rental prices have gone to as well. It's a hard thing for the families, but it's also hard things for investors and growth as well.
And I think we all can agree there's a housing issue here. It's not, no one's saying that there's not a housing crisis in California. It's just the question is does this solve it? I don't know. I don't think so. Like I said, to be the devil's advocate, yes, there is a problem 100%, but does this solve that problem? I don't know.
And I think it's also, you brought up a good point in mentioning that, other solutions. I mean, obviously if someone had the right answer, I feel like we'd be going down that road already. But there are other things I hear, when you listen to these talks about rent control, such as like incentives, maybe like real estate property tax breaks for landlords who offer, maybe like more rent controlled housing, or even, we see a lot of like subsidies for like housing vouchers provided through the government. I mean, there's obviously other routes to go. Maybe some are more high cost than not. But I just think it's interesting to maybe like think about or discuss some of the other options besides just rent control, because obviously that's one topic of discussion, but also there's other solutions that I think are out there, depending on maybe how expensive they are or not to implement. I'm not sure, but just interesting to see there.
Well, an example of an initiative that helped, I don't know how big of a dent it actually made, but I know it helped some, is the allowing of ADUs to be built. And so that increased the supply of housing in the state of California on its own. And so it sounds like kind of the general consensus from all of us is that these type of incentives like that, being able to build additional units or change your zoning and things like that, those incentives to entrepreneurs and investors are going to do more for the protecting of the rental rates than the government interference will. How about this Weinstein character? You guys read up on him at all?
Yeah, it seems kind of confusing because he's on both sides of it. He's got investment properties himself. He's running the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is what's backing all of this, which is confusing because it doesn't seem like the mission statement there. He's paying $2 per signature for these letters that are advocating for this measure right now. It's hard to tell what side he's coming from or why he's doing any of this.
So is he buying votes for something else really here? Like if he's like pretending to represent the general population on this topic, maybe they'll support him for another initiative that he has going. Is that what it is? It's like you said, he's a known slumlord is what I've seen him described as. And he's known for misappropriating funds from the AIDS Foundation as well. I saw that the AIDS Foundation bought 10 luxury condos in Florida in the last couple of years and flipped them all.
Yeah, so he's speculating. He's doing the thing that it's the opposite of what he's pushing here. It's weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that's why he's trying to impose these laws in California, is because he's investing in other states. And they know
People to
that.
move.
Yeah, it'll make people move. We already have a slight exodus out of California since COVID started. And it seems like this would only make it substantially worse.
Yeah, and he's already said that every single year that he's always going to be pushing for this too. And he's pretty much said, I'll pay whatever kind of money it takes to continue to do it. So that's like CAA's approach, is to get him basically blocked from being able to do that. Because that's just, I mean, that's a lot of money on all sides that's just going down the drain.
Which is valid though. I mean, I saw that he used like $100 million on political stances that weren't really aligned with the AIDS Foundation. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous, right?
Yeah. This is the third time he's done this.
Yeah.
Sounds like a cowboy. So what can people do if they are kind of in agreement with us and they want to oppose this bill?
They could vote for the Protect Patients Now Act, which calls for regulation of those kinds of programs, the one that he's used to kind of put himself in this position.
Yep, that's exactly it. And then I think also just like continue to educate people about, hey, we already have rent control. And for the mass population, this doesn't really affect them. It's only for people in single family homes and buildings built after 1995. But the Protect Patients Now Act is definitely the first one.
I'd say maybe the last thing I would say is, to Kyle's point, is for people to get educated on what these measures actually are, because sometimes they are, spoken about in a way that makes it seem like it's going for one thing and then you vote for it. But in actuality, it does the opposite, or it doesn't do what you think you're voting for. So the most important part when voting on anything, but especially stuff like this, is educating yourself on what the measures actually are.
Yeah, 100%. We all know from past experiences and past laws, sometimes people vote for things and then they're like, oh, wait, I didn't know that's what I voted for. And then they get pretty upset and then they have to go down and repeal that law later.
Especially when it's a law like, hey, we're going to help you out. We're going to, do rent control. You're going to pay less each month. It seems like a win-win, but in reality, sometimes it's not always that simple.
Sure.
Yeah, a lot of these appeal to the emotion of the vast majority, but might not be in the interest of the vast majority in the long run. So looking into both sides of it, like we're mentioning, is definitely a strong thing to do before making any decisions in your mind.
And I wonder if this could also, if it went through, it could affect the contractors as well. Because if there's less work being done, there's less construction. They could take another hit in an industry where they're still reeling from 2008 and 2015, when a lot of people got out of the business, and it takes 4 to 6 years for apprentices to get up to speed. So now we're just getting back to a critical mass of contractors who can do work. And if we did this, it might cut back on their workload as well.
I'm already seeing a lot of people that I do work with, like, new homes are slowing down substantially, and now it's just people are doing some renovations and things like that. But since the rise in interest rates, projects have dropped a lot. And I actually had 2 companies that I did a lot of work with actually shut down. 2 large plumbing companies. One just laid off 20 employees, and then the other one went bankrupt. And they do mostly just residential work, and it's just slowed down to a point where they couldn't, 20 employees they had to drop off. And to your point, I think this would just perpetuate that.
Well, do you think any of those employees are renters?
Yeah, I'd say all of them, because these are all, working class. You've got laborers, and then starting plumbers and installers. And I'd say, at least 80% of those guys are renters.